Hello, this is my second lecture for this module number 4 in the week of July 20th, the halfway mark of our course on human rights, law, and government. Thank you for your attention to these lectures and your participation in this class, which I believe will serve you well in your ongoing studies in the area of peace studies in particular, but even if you are in the MA program in religious studies, it has wide and significant relevance to those studies as well. The first lecture of this module I gave talks about natural law theory and compares it with three other theories: the positivist theory of law, the realist theory of law, and the critical theory of law. And natural law is important because it is the system of law that kind of underlies the concept of even of international law, of universal human rights, of an international court of justice, of an international criminal court, because it implies the idea that there are things that all human beings can come to agree on in terms of what's right and wrong. And even that something like genocide is not just a practical issue, but it or a legal issue only, but it's a moral issue, that it's inherently wrong, and that all human beings can recognize that. Uh, Even the perpetrator knows that something is wrong with genocide, or that something was wrong with the Holocaust that destroyed the lives of 6 million Jews and others, that this is a horrific violation of what it means to be human. So this is rooted in this concept of natural law. That's why the accent is there, but also talking about these other theories, the realist theory, the positivist theory, and the critical theory of law. But now we're going to look at this broader concept called rule of law, which is another attempt, you could say, to establish universality of law, that rule of law should be practiced universally because it's rooted, again, in some kind of inherent, basic moral quality and rational quality of our being human. It doesn't depend on our religion, rule of law, but it somehow depends on our humanity because we can recognize that the rule of law should apply universally. So that's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture, uh, and that we may say that all the constitutions of the world, we kind of looked at the U.S. Constitution. In some ways, it was the eldest son of the development of democratic constitutions that followed over the next 2.5 centuries. Um, so rule of law is a fundamental principle of governance. Governance is different from government. A government is the system of rule and structure set up in your country with an executive, legislative, and judicial branch, etc. Governance refers to the quality of how we govern in the government. So just making that distinction between government and governance. Governance can also apply outside of a government. So even the governance of a school, the governance of a not-for-profit organization, the governance of a church or a mosque or any religion. So let us take a look now at rule of law as I share my screen. And if all goes well, uh, we'll I think we're there. So, Module 4, Human Rights Law and Government. Natural law, which we already covered in the previous recorded lecture, and now focuses on rule of law. Here's the wheel of the rule of law over here on the right. But essentially, this is saying over here, because it's hard to read in the diagram, no one's above the law. The law, if you're driving your automobile recklessly, that applies whether you're the president or the parliamentarian or a laborer or a teacher. No one's above that. You're still held accountable. Law is also applied equally and fairly. So if you're the president or you're a laborer, the president would be charged a fine of $200 and the laborer would be charged a fine of $200, and you would be evaluated fairly according to the principle of rule of law. That law should be known. There shouldn't be hidden laws that were never publicly announced. And they should be accessible to citizens to know what the laws are and to know when they would be violating a law or not, so that the government couldn't just suddenly invent a law in order to incriminate a citizen and put them in jail or fine them an amount of money. That in rule of law, even if you're accused of a crime, you're presumed innocent until you are presented before a judge and perhaps a jury to hear the charges against you and to give your defense. So the presumption of innocence is an important principle of the rule of law. That the judicial system, the judiciary of a country or a region or district should be open, independent. It shouldn't be controlled by one powerful sector, by, say, wealthy people or highly placed political people who control political power. The judiciary should be independent and therefore also impartial, meaning I don't play favorites. Oh, this person is here in the courtroom and they're my cousin, so I'm not going to sentence them. But this person was an enemy of my cousin. I'm going to sentence them. No, it should be impartial. That laws should not be passed retrospectively. That means kind of looking back or pulling them out of thin air, so to speak, to implicate someone. The law must already be clearly established. Laws are made in an open, transparent way by the people, not by the people directly. Most often, laws are created by the legislature, but the people vote to elect the representatives who sit in the parliament or the Congress or the legislature and who are then empowered by the people based on their fair election to enact laws in respect for the people. If those legislatures seem to be disregarding the will of their constituents, those constituents at the next election cycle can vote them out of power. That government agencies should behave as model litigants. That means they should not try to play this system or corrupt the system, but should follow rule of law. Trials should be fair and prompt. You shouldn't be arrested and put in jail for 6 months, and you don't even know what the charges against you are or when the trial will take place. That separation of powers, which we've discussed frequently in this course already, should be there so that the judiciary is not under the legislature or under the executive, that it has its independence and impartiality, that punishment should be in accordance with law. They should be reasonable punishments based on the crime. If you've committed murders, then your crime will be much greater than if you drove your car too fast, too too much above the speed limit. Uh, and the law should be open to criticism, that if many citizens come forward and identify a particular law as unjust or unfair, that should be taken into consideration by the legislature. So reform should be possible. So these are core principles that are outlined here in this kind of wheel of the rule of law. Um, now, the importance of law in the society, and this particular diagram makes 4 points. Number one, law provides justice to the weak and to victims. Uh, And two, it ensures peace and equality in society. One purpose of law is to keep order in society. A lawless society is not a more free society because that freedom becomes unrestricted. So it means I have the freedom to do whatever I want, take your property. I can abuse people. That's part of my freedom. No, law limits those freedoms in a reasonable way. So it ensures the peace and the equality of society. In international law, no nation is allowed to invade another nation without provocation. So that helps ensure the peace. So law helps resolve conflicts among people. In past ages, if your neighbor committed a wrong, you would have to plan your personal revenge, and this could escalate. But in civilized countries, if you've been wrong, you take that to the courts, and then you appear in the courts, and a judge evaluates the circumstances and makes an impartial ruling that resolves the problem. Maybe everyone's not completely happy, but it's a resolution that people accept the authority of the court system. That law helps correct people's behavior by creating a positive impact. So also, sometimes even if we have a desire or we are tempted to do bad things, we will refrain from that because we fear the punishment or the shame that will come. And this can help us eventually grow to become better people. And law and society reminds us that punishment is always there when we violate laws that have been established for the good of the society and the good of the people and the good of you who are considering to violate the law. Those laws there are helpful to you. That means you're a thief, but the law prevents other persons who would also like to be a thief from stealing what you've already stolen. So uh, punishment is a deterrence. It deters people from committing crimes. So again, I'm going to quickly go through types of law. This is different from theories of law. It's kind of different areas of jurisdiction, we could say, of law. There's constitutional law, which is the supreme law of a country or the land. And it shows the power and limits of the government. It identifies rights. There's the common law system. That's the law developed through courts and cases decided over time. Uh, there's statutory law. This is produced by legislatures at the federal, state, or local levels. There's this concept of international law, which is the law that applies between different nation states through treaties. For example, there's criminal law, which is an offense against the state or society as a whole, such as a murder or a theft. There's a civil law, which are more private disputes between parties, that one neighbor harms the property of another, that neighbor will bring them to court. And this is tort law, it's called, non-contractual civil wrongs between parties, such as personal injury. If I am walking on the sidewalk and I trip and fall because you failed to fix a, a hole or a pothole in your sidewalk, then I may sue you, take you to court over that. Assault and battery cases, defamation, invasion of privacy, emotional distress. These are come under this category called tort law. And then there's a special case of military law that has its own spheres of jurisdiction and uniqueness due to security issues that surround the nature of the responsibilities of those within the military. Again, in rule of law, law is superior to arbitrary power. Law not only restrains the people, it restrains those with power, that they cannot simply impose their will on others. So law stands higher than raw, arbitrary, brute power. Sometimes you hear the expression, might makes right. Might meaning my greater power. That if I have the greater power, I can just decide what's right or wrong because I have the power to do it. Law says no. There's a law. Whether you're powerful or weak, you're both held accountable to any violation of the law. Under rule of law, all are equal before the law. That's another way of describing item one there. And that the judiciary should be and must be independent so that laws can be applied fairly and equally, that there's separation of powers, that the law is made by representatives of the people. That means you're parliamentarian, you're member of Congress, the person who's elected from your particular geographic district where you live. They represent you and the people of your region in the parliament. They sit there and they are accountable to you as a citizen and to your fellow citizens because you can have them removed from power at the time of the next election. So they're accountable to you. But the laws, they have you in mind when they make those laws. They're not just inventing them out of thin air for their own selfish purposes. They're thinking the people that I represent, I'm voting for this law because I know that will serve the people of my district well. That laws should be transparent, that people are aware of the law and its consequences, that punishments are in accordance with the law. Laws cannot be changed to fit the crime, and that trials must be fair and promptly carried out without unnecessary delays so that someone who's innocent must go through this long, long, long ordeal that's rooted in either the dysfunctional nature of the judicial system or the unfairness of the judicial system. And there must be presumption of innocence. So a number of these items about describing rule of law, I realize there's a little bit of repetition in this presentation, but I think that repetition will also help you better grasp these core aspects, principles, characteristics of the rule of law. Another aspect of rule of law is that rule of law brings benefits to a society. One would be economic benefits. That if there's a rule of law, then it means there's stability in the country. It means that contracts can be relied upon, can be trusted. That if I want to invest in another country, I want to buy property, that our agreement will be honored and respected, backed up by the law, enforced by the law. So it increases investment. People don't want to invest in an unstable country or a judiciary that just acts according to the will of some dictator. So rule of law reduces corruption, because corruption comes when the law is not enforced or when it is the judiciary looks the other way and allows corruption to go forward. Rule of law supports innovation and entrepreneurism. There's also political benefits to rule of law. It strengthens democracy because it also limits government. The government itself is accountable before the law and cannot act arbitrarily. It supports separation of powers. It enhances judicial independence. It promotes anti-corruption. So economic benefits, political benefits, human rights benefits. Human rule of law promotes human dignity and fairness. It promotes equality and non-discrimination, fosters social cohesion, and builds trust among people. Distrust multiplies and then dampens the capacity of cooperation among people. And it is cooperation that most often contributes to wealth production and to harmony in the society. So these aspects of rule of law bring great benefits to a society. When rule of law breaks down, that leads to a state becoming a failing state or a failed state. And as a nation becomes closer to being a failed state, this instability that starts out with the breakdown of the rule of law leads to widespread chaos and conflict, and then leads to some, usually or often, some dictator taking control, using the military to back it up, and arbitrary power takes over. So the Magna Carta in 1215 was a major moment in establishing the rule of law when the barons, property owners, confronted King John and demanded that no freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or deceased, deprived of property, that is, or exiled, or in any way destroyed, nor will we go upon him nor send upon him, except by lawful judgment of his peers, by the law of the land. So this was in the Magna Carta some 800 years ago. Life, liberty, and property cannot be arbitrarily taken away. This is some 550 years prior to the Declaration of Independence. Any judgment or punishment must be in accordance with law, not arbitrary feeling or a moment of anger, rooted in the law. James Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary, because we'd all follow the eternal law, the natural law of God. But law is there also because we are not angels. We're not perfect, and we need to be constrained. Remember, law has to be backed up by force, by coercion, by the ability to enforce a law. That's why you have police forces, not to oppress you in your country, just like you have a military, not to oppress the citizens, but to protect the boundaries so that there is not invasion from a hostile force. Likewise, the police is there to protect citizens from those who would violate the law. And they must have the instruments of enforcement, which is more than sweet words or pleading. Oh, please don't commit a crime. Oh, you did it once, you did it twice. Oh, please don't do it again. No, the enforcement instruments have to be persuasive. And that's why in most countries, the police carry weapons, and the capacity to arrest and imprison a citizen who there is strong reason to believe is violating the law. So government must control the governed, but it also must control itself. It cannot use arbitrary power. So governments must have a built-in mechanism to restrain itself from overreach. That's the separation of powers. An independent judiciary is needed. Citizens also must trust the government and trust the laws and obey the laws. Constitutions and laws must include safeguards to assure fair trials, impartial tribunals, equality before the law. Martin Luther King, and this is rooted in natural law theory, that unjust laws need not be obeyed. So that gave rise to the tradition of civil disobedience practiced by people like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. So the American Bar Association's World Justice Project identified 4 principles of the rule of law. Number 1, a system of self-government in which all persons, including the government, are accountable under the law. Number 2, a system based on fair, publicized, that means they're open and transparent, broadly understood, and stable laws. 3, a fair, robust, accessible legal process in which rights and responsibilities based in law are evenly enforced, meaning they're not arbitrarily enforced, but evenly enforced. And enforced means backed up by power, that the government must have instruments of power that allow them to restrain a citizen and, if necessary, arrest a citizen. And rule of law requires diverse, competent, independent lawyers and judges. So you need a well-educated group of attorneys, lawyers, and judges who also are fair-minded and have the interest of the people and the society at heart. So rule of law is a normatively demanding, institutionally realized ideal that all countries aspire to. It's concerned with ruling power, that is, with the threat of disorderly, arbitrarily exercised ruling power. Rule of law disciplines or limits power. So rule of law applies not only to keeping the order among citizens, but rule of law is there to discipline or to oversee and monitor the behavior of the ruling power so that that power is not misused or that power does not violate the law that has been set up in the interest of all the people. Those who exercise ruling power must submit to law. This is where you get the principle, no one is above the law. So accountable to others, rule of law means that all people, especially those who wield power, are held accountable for their actions. No one is above the law, even if you're the president. So 3 core principles. The law is sovereign. And it's not the individual, it's the legal system. It's equal in the eyes of the law, all citizens, and fidelity, an ethos of responsibility in holding one another to account under the law. So rule of law doesn't seek to disable power, but to keep it in check, to discipline it. And it requires that law be consistent, intelligible, fair, impartial. Rule of law, accountability is central. Anyone who violates the law, no matter their position in society or government, must be held accountable. That is, responsible. And it's important to comply with constitutional norms and regulations. That rule of law must be ethical, knowledgeable, and responsible legal profession and judiciary is required. So these are some of the core aspects. Again, rule of law is the key to prosperity, economic growth, political and economic reform. And some articles talk about comparing countries and their rule of law, like Rwanda, following the genocidal period in Rwanda and Burundi. Rwanda has, in the eyes of some, become a model nation of development and rule of law. And contrast this with Nigeria, which has been less orderly and manageable, and how the aspects of rule of law contribute to the growing prosperity of a particular country. So governments should make rule of law and reform of their legal system a strategic priority. That they should invest in judicial independence and capacity. That means independence from the executive office, particularly. Should combat corruption and build trust. Engage citizens in legal and constitutional reforms. So donors to internet and international financial institutions should be considering linking aid that they provide and financing to measurable improvements in rule of law. You don't want to invest in a country that is corrupt, that has no rule of law, because that means that there can be arbitrary misuse of that investment by the executive branch or the legislative branch. So the donors and financials should prioritize partnerships with countries that practice rule of law, the countries with a free media that are committed to the development of their civil society and that prioritize the justice sector and anti-corruption. Also, the private sector investors should champion transparency in contracts and dispute resolution, promote best practices, and advocate for stable, predictable legal environment. So in the United Nations, whose three pillars are peace and security, human rights, and development, rule of law is essential. Rule of law is a principle of governance for all, wherein A, laws are publicly promulgated, B, they're equally and fairly applied and enforced, C, independently adjudicated, D, consistent with international human rights norms and standards. The UN affirms the principles of supremacy of the law made by representatives of the people, not by just some executive or inner circle, but by the duly elected legislature. Equality before the law, independent judiciary, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making by the people, legal certainty that laws are understood and that they're applied fairly, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. So these are affirmed by the United Nations, who understands the importance and value and necessity of rule of law for nations to be prosperous, to even be stable, and to not descend into chaos, disorder, deeper and deeper levels of poverty and violence. So rule of law is very, very central to building a world of peace. So rule of law is fundamental to peace and security and political stability. It's fundamental to economic and social progress and development. It's fundamental to protections of human rights and freedoms. These are the three pillars of the United Nations. So the rule of law is linked to development, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations. Sustainable Development Goal 16 is for inclusive, accountable justice systems. So it's a high priority at the United Nations. So this concept of rule of law is very important and very essential in this course on human rights, law, and government. So that concludes my lecture for Module 4, and we'll continue. Our next module will be looking at the United Nations. So we kind of conclude this lecture getting us kind of moving toward the United Nations. All right, everyone. Thank you for your kind attention.